The path of easing that people were expecting coming from the Fed, it's not going to happen the way they saw it. There are tensions building. There are tensions that really concern me.
What are you seeing now is driving the U.S. economy?
This incredible entrepreneurial spirit. The impact on the economy, especially in the near term, the next 4 or 5 years, is not going to be super consequential. I'd be very surprised if the Chinese permit us to buy real estate within a mile of whatever military institution.
Yeah. Welcome back to the Better Decisions podcast. I am sitting here today with a high economic mind. This is David Andolfatto, who is the professor of economics at University of Miami. David, thank you for coming in to do this podcast with me.
Well, you're welcome, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
This is, again, we were talking just off camera. There's some overwhelming moments where, you're talking to somebody who spent their life ingrained in economics, and I like to think of myself as a frustrated economist. I think that's actually on my profile on my my Facebook page, but I know that you're in this all the time, so I'm expecting I'm going to learn a lot of stuff in this podcast today, and hopefully you're going to free my mind from some of my preconceived ideas and notions that may be misplaced. David, I'd love to start just for those out there. Tell us again what you do. And then once we get into it, I want to understand your beliefs as an economist, what you're grounded in. And then we're going to dive into, and we're going to get into the global economy, the national economy, and of course, Miami, the local economy.
Sure thing, David. Just before I start, I want to say that I share your lament in terms of being a frustrated economist. I think all economists are probably frustrated. It's a learning process. It's a lifelong learning process. I'm presently professor and chair at the economics department at the Miami Herbert Business School. I came down here 2 years ago, kind of with a mission to build the economics department into a world-class department. So I'm heavily involved in the administration of the department, contributing to the administration of the business school, recruiting, and on the side, continuing on with my research, which entails mainly monetary policy, monetary and fiscal policy.
And that's an area that, as we just mentioned that, you were working with the Fed. You were involved with the Fed, which is something that, let's start there as a point of economics. As we're dealing with right now, the Fed just announced a rate cut 2 weeks ago of like 0.5 point, and everyone automatically assumes, that means mortgage rates are going down. Explain how the Fed works for those out there who don't know, because I think that's probably a good start just as one point.
Oh boy, where to start? It's true. I was at the Fed for 13 years, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in particular, and it is true what you say that to many people the Fed is a mysterious institution. Some people refer to it as the creature of Jekyll Island in reference to the meeting that took place on Jekyll Island that led to its formation. The Fed is the third attempt in the United States to form a central bank. The first two, the charters were not renewed. This incarnation was formed by an act of Congress in 1913. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the Federal Reserve, the United States Federal Reserve System, is a creature of Congress. It was formed through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which stipulates the mandates of the Fed and the powers that it has. Many people believe that the Fed, for short, has very, very powerful tools. In a sense, it does. It's mandated with facilitating, supporting the commercial banking sector and its credit and payment operations. So the Fed plays an instrumental role in making sure that our payments are processed in an orderly and safe manner every day. The Fed is also mandated with financial stability, so it's a lender of last resort. And it's also mandated with keeping inflation low and stable, and doing whatever it can to support the labor market and the general prosperity of the American economy. So that's what the Fed is and what it does. It's interesting that it was formed as a bit of a compromise back in 1913 in the sense that it is not purely a public institution. The 12 regional Feds in particular are actually legally private corporations. So myself, for example, when I was working at the St. Louis Fed, I was not a government employee.
So it's a private. These Feds are private corporations. I think
they're chartered as private corporations.
Okay.
They have shareholders. The shares are non-tradable. They earn a dividend. I think it's the members of the member banks of each region that are owners of legally owners. Of course, it's not purely private. It's kind of a public-private partnership. So the profits that are generated by the Federal Reserve System are remitted back to the U.S. Treasury. So it's an interesting hybrid. It's a typical American compromise between a public and private sector enterprise. But the key thing is to understand what it is. It's a central bank that is designed to support the money and credit system in the U.S. economy and to basically manage the rate of inflation and support the general well-being of American people.
So with that in mind, given the fact that what does it mean when the Fed drops the rate by 0.5 point? What does that directly influence the man on the street? How does that work? How does that process then work?
Exactly. That's a very good question. And, the primary tool that the Fed has been using in its recent incarnations is basically trying to manage the short-term interest rates that influence the entire spectrum of interest rates all along the yield curve. And essentially, the Fed's mandated to keep inflation low and stable and to help support the labor market. Now, how does it accomplish that? By varying the interest rate? Well, if the Fed sees that inflationary pressures are building, it's going to tend to want to raise that interest rate to kind of suppress consumer demand, investment demand, basically the demand side of the economy, to kind of cool things off a little bit, to keep price pressures, to keep a lid on price pressures, and in that manner, it fulfills its inflation mandate. It tries to put, if inflation starts to get a little bit away from target, they're going to raise the interest rate to bring inflation back down. If, on the other hand, they see the labor market weakening, kind of the opposite, they're going to do the opposite. They're going to lower the policy interest rate with the idea of making it easier for consumers to borrow, for motivate companies to spend on CapEx, and in that way stimulate the real economy.
So does that mean that sorry to interject, so does that mean that when they've dropped the interest rate by 0.5 point, they believe that the labor market's weakening?
It is a combination of things. What they in the recent decision was motivated in part by the fact that inflation, which peaked in the summer of 2022 at an unusually high level, inflation has been more or less coming down, more or less steadily.
Yep.
And it's coming down. It's about 2.5%, the official measure. Excuse me. And so they see the inflation rate coming down, and at the same time we see the labor market starting to soften a little bit. And so with the policy rate at over 5%, they saw scope for cutting by 50 basis points as kind of trading off these two forces.
Are we expecting to see more with the way that you're viewing it? Obviously, you have experience with the Fed, having worked with the Federal Bank of St. Louis. Are you anticipating that we'll see additional rate cuts come November and December, which is what's been out there within the media?
Well, I mean, I think that I have a little bit of a rebel view, I guess, I've had for a while. Since the beginning of the year, I thought it very unlikely that we'd see any rate cuts at all, given the how high inflation was. So that was counter to, earlier in the year, people were pricing in 4 cuts. I tweeted out back in the spring of last year that I could see perhaps 1 cut, and then the possibility of reversing it if inflationary pressures didn't reverse.
Definitely goes against maybe the grain of what was out there in the media. What was your thought process right there? So
to me, the thought process was really what I saw on the fiscal side, and conditional on the fiscal, where the deficits are pretty large, and so the Treasury's pumping out a lot of Treasury paper out there for the global economy to absorb. Now, there's a big demand for Treasury paper, and the evolution of that demand over time is something that's very difficult to forecast. But there's got to be a limit to how much the global economy can absorb. And because I don't see very much on the horizon in terms of curtailing that deficit, I had in mind that I saw that the fiscal side of the economy is going to generate inflationary pressures. Either interest rates are going to go up or inflation's going to go up, or both. And so I was a little bit skeptical that that inflation would come down as fast as it did. In fact, it did come down faster than I thought. But
yeah, it was up.
We saw the recent job reports just this morning. Kind of suggests that the 50 basis points cut was perhaps a bit premature.
Really? And what does that, unpack that for a second, that situation with how you see it with the job market?
Well, the report this morning was very, very bullish, right? I mean, we had over 250,000 net new jobs created relative to a forecast that was down in the 100,000s. The last numbers were being revised upwards. So evidently, the labor market is not quite as soft as what people were expecting. This is good news. But what it does suggest is that the path of easing that people were expecting coming from the Fed, probably it's not going to happen the way they saw. And you saw that this morning with the 10-year. You saw a significant jump in longer-term interest rates.
So getting into, and I want to unpack, and I want to start from a wide perspective to help people understand. And again, my life is spent living under the microscope of the South Florida real estate market, Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. And I know that's probably not let's say, a good representation of the rest of the country, the rest of the world, certainly not. But it's just the reality I'm with. And again, what I do is I try to reflect on what are the forces at play that are affecting the people that I deal with every day, and the people who live in South Florida. What are the things they need to be aware of? When we get into economics, there are a lot of things that people focus on and many that they don't. What is it that they don't pay attention to? First of all, I'd like to start with, what do you believe as an economist? If you can summarize your basis of belief as an economist?
Wow. Okay. My belief is, first and foremost, I'm an American citizen, and I'm concerned with the general well-being of our country. I think the institutions that we've erected have, while imperfect, they've been the best, basically, we've come up with, and have resulted in the widest level of prosperity that humankind has ever seen. So I think it's something worth defending. And the way we defend that is to make sure that these institutions, remain in place and of course, perhaps evolve according to the situation as things change, but that they need to be defended and that Americans need to look after each other. We need to look after each other. Americans have always been, they never begrudge people becoming rich.
That's the American dream, isn't it?
It's the American dream. It's about what we need to do is to preserve the mobility. We need to preserve a situation where people feel like they have an opportunity, if they work hard and are smart enough, that they can share in the prosperity. So I think first and foremost, as an economist, I am concerned about the general well-being of the nation. What sort of institutions, what sort of policies kind of are best designed to achieve that result. Understanding, of course, that we'll never be perfect. We can never be perfect in this endeavor. So first and foremost, that is what drives me as an economist.
Yeah, and I know you can please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please all the people all the time, which is obviously the challenges that we have across the broad spectrum of people that live in this country. Starting out at a wide scale, because I think it's helpful to sometimes be aware of your peripherals. I think it's always important to be aware of your peripherals. Let's start with the global economy. How do you see the global economy today doing? How do you see the general balance across the globe?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, you can take I like to take a big picture view, bird's eye view. The global economy, there's been tremendous progress around the world. The poverty rates have plummeted, child mortality rates have plummeted. By almost every metric you can look at, people around the world are by and large better off than they were, say, at the end of the Second World War. And so, in the grand scheme of things, things are looking pretty good. Now, there are tensions building, and there are tensions that really concern me. A lot of these are political tensions. We see them manifesting themselves today in the Middle East in particular, Russia, Ukraine, and the one that really concerns me is in the South Pacific with China and Taiwan. So I can continue to speak about what exactly it is that keeps me awake at night and what that implies in terms of the economy. but I'll let you ask that question if you want.
Yeah, I want to know. I want to know what keeps you awake at night, because again, we've all got our things that we're always looking for danger. It's our human nature,
well,
and I think sometimes we don't see it when we should.
Well, okay, so here's one way of looking at it. I mean, I'm a student of history. I look at history, and by the way, it's just to say it's not clear that my fears will come true. It's just. I think, nevertheless, it's important to understand what the risks are.
Yeah.
And to be prepared.
Yeah.
For these risks, even if they do not ultimately manifest themselves. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, what do I see? I see the big picture view. Since 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has been basically the world's sole global superpower.
Okay.
And the United States has been riding that wave. It's been riding that wave. I mean, it's been part of the reason why the U.S. government can run such large deficits. There's a global demand for this U.S. Treasury as a safe haven. The U.S. Treasury is used as basically an instrument to facilitate financial market flows around the world. Mm-hmm. People use it as money. And the United States is in the privileged position of issuing a lot of these treasuries because the globe wants them and needs them. And this is the reason why, one reason why the United States has been able to run such large deficits, and interest rates have been remaining low. And
our deficit right now, and this is again something that we hear around the world and people love to throw these numbers around. What is the current US deficit as it stands today?
Well, one answer is it doesn't matter. Depending on what the situation is. It did not matter when the U.S. was the global superpower, I would say, but I would say that the world has since changed. China has emerged as a bona fide, legitimate global geopolitical rival. Mm-hmm. And now you have to think about the world kind of segmenting itself. I mean, perhaps a lot of the demand for the U.S. Treasury from countries in Southeast Asia, they now turn to China, for example. So suddenly now the demand for the U.S. Treasury might not be as great as it was before. What sort of fiscal pressures does an emergent China put on the U.S. government? Are we going to have to increase our military? Our Pacific Fleet, I hear, is depleted and diverted to the Middle East. What happens if China they are becoming more aggressive in terms of Taiwan? What happens if this emergent Cold War becomes a hot war? What sort of fiscal pressures would that imply for the U.S. government? Oh, well, okay, let's go down that path. Let's imagine a Cold War. Let's imagine a rearming. Let's imagine what this is going to entail. War economies typically run hot. That means a lot of people are going to be employed. It might mean rationing for consumer goods, because as the economy diverts production away from consumer goods to kind of military hardware, but everybody's going to be working. It's going to mean inflationary pressure. It's going to mean interest rate pressure. So if you're thinking about in terms of, I wonder what this implies for real estate market.
Well, that's where it goes, because once we get to this international conversation, people think to themselves, we hear about wars, and obviously we just recently in this last week, we've obviously had, Iran and Israel. We've had that, this conversation, and people say, how does this affect me at a local level? And that's where I guess it becomes very real.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's kind of two ways to think about. First of all, on a human level, it's a tragedy. These global conflicts are tragedies, right? I mean, this is a given. But of course, these events do have implications for how local economies are going to evolve. And I was trying to give your listeners a little bit of a hint. If these events were to transpire, and let's pray to God they do not, but if they do, these fiscal pressures placed on the U.S. government are just going to be more deficits, higher deficits, and more deficits are going to exert inflationary and interest rate pressure to the upside. Inflationary pressure is going to be met by higher interest rates to the Fed. And so one way or the other, you're going to get some combination of higher interest rates and higher inflation. But on kind of the quote-unquote plus side, the employment side of the economy is going to remain robust as well. I mean, one thing that you care about in terms of real estate prices is whether there's people are unemployed and can afford the mortgages, for example.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the general market, and there's the higher level market, which obviously what I deal with. But I think it's interesting that what you just said there, and sometimes people don't think about this, is that if you want to use this as some form of equation, a Cold War turning into a hot war will mean a more expensive mortgage when you buy a house, potentially because your interest rates could go up and cost of living for goods, services, other things could go up. So again, apart from the human tragedy, there's a human.
And David, it's really important to remain humble here in our predictions about interest rates, because so much depends on how the Fed reacts. The Fed and the Treasury would react to the emergency. Now, look, if it's a Cold War, I think what you said is right, that the pressure is likely to release itself mainly in higher interest rates, because the Fed will be raising interest rates to curtail the inflationary pressure, and the Fed has a mandate to keep inflation low and stable. But if this conflict was to turn hot, see the way it did in 1941, you can forget about high interest rates. It's going to be the exact opposite. In 1941, the U.S. and the Treasury consolidated to keep interest rates very low all along the yield curve. And so this is in part because during a war like this, you want the monetary authority will support the fiscal authority to help finance the war effort. And the Fed from 1942 to 1951 kept the entire spectrum of interest rates flat. Well, but then the inflationary pressure will not manifest itself as higher interest rates. It'll manifest itself as higher inflation rates. So just to let your listeners know, I mean, it's going to kind of depend on whether how these pressures manifest themselves. Cold versus hot wars make a big difference in terms of interest rates and inflation.
Interesting. The other side of, and again, on a global scale, and I see this every day of people moving in. Again, we have a lot of people coming in from Europe, coming in from many other countries actually across the globe, particularly into Miami, is geosafety, the feeling of being somewhere that you can live with your family and you can be safe. And of course, we've seen that with pressures. Typically, Miami has always been a haven for people coming in from South American countries, looking not just for financial security and safety, suffering from super high inflationary pressures that they see in there, whether it's Venezuela or Brazil or other countries, or coming here simply because it's just safe, just because their family feels safe and they feel like they're going to have a better quality of life. I feel, and I noticed that I'm obviously from the UK, so I would have actually a surprisingly higher number of people coming in from Europe, because they say Europe's in a mess. It's just that the quality of life is not what it was. I'm finding, whether it's education or general safety or just general quality of life, I'm finding that the US, particularly Miami, is still giving me the American dream.
I mean, absolutely. That's what the power of our institutions are, is that they attract people from all over the world. I always tell people, I mean, if you think we're doing so badly, look where people want to migrate. They want to migrate to the United States. By the way, I find it interesting that you're from the UK. Of course, I'm also part of from the Commonwealth. I'm originally Canadian, so
of course, good old Canadian. We share a lot of things in common, including our chocolate. Weirdly enough, Cadbury's chocolate. This will be lost on Americans. I hate to say it, but there's a lot of British candy that you see in Canada.
Correct. A lot of the institutions we have here were, of course, borrowed from the mother country, the UK, and Canada as well is also.
That's why you're so polite, isn't it? That's why Canadians are so polite. I dig that.
Well, you haven't seen us on the hockey rink. I mean,
oh yeah, that's true. That's where all the frustration comes out.
Right.
So with that global situation going on, do you see it as right now, for those people who may be coming in across the world? Do you have a positive outlook right now for that? How is your outlook for the global economy and as people kind of come into the US, and we'll transition into that next, into the national economy?
Right. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but things right now are not looking very good, especially right now with what's happening in the Middle East and Russia, Ukraine, of course. And of course, I am keeping my eye on Southeast Asia too. The war exercises that China's undertaking around Taiwan have been evidently escalating. It's the Chinese Communist Party's 75th anniversary. Xi Jinping has explicitly, evidently said that he looks forward to the reunification before the 75th birthday of the party. So I see a lot of, potential downside that could, create a huge refugee crisis. I mean, if you think the flows trying to get into safe havens like the U.S. are bad now, I mean, they could potentially get even much, much worse. Now, on the plus side, we are the safe havens. So the question, though, is really, do we have the capacity to absorb large flows of immigrants in a seamless manner? In Canada, for example, which has increased, the population has increased from 30 to 40 million in a very short period of time. Through the government's explicit immigration policy, we see tremendous pressure on housing, tremendous social pressure in terms of housing costs and the general inability of the infrastructure to just basically accommodate.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to play this smart. We have to be ready. Governments, both at national, state, local level, I think should have contingency plans in place to help deal with these types of immigration flows. They're going to come.
And immigration flows coming in obviously can come from all sides. Obviously, those close onto the borderline have more of a challenge. I mean, I'm just thinking of California right now. There's a lot of noise, obviously, out of California to do with migration and immigration coming in and not being stemmed, which obviously then affects directly the cities around Southern California and quality of life. And, we look, and again, we'll get into this at a more local level, which gets into as it trickles down into affordability. Yes. The ability to be able to house people at a satisfactory level and give them the quality of life that they clearly want. But again, it's just too many people around the buffet and not enough food to go around.
Well, yes. I mean, although I think there is the capacity here in the United States to absorb these people, I think it's more of a will, a political will. It's difficult to do, I think. I mean, it's easy to say, difficult to do. And of course, there are limits at some level. But if you fly across the country,
yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of open space. I mean,
there's a lot of there is. I mean, of course, there's lots of land. Interestingly enough, it's always curious to know. Yes, you go into certain parts of the country now, and you'll see like large amounts of open space, which is not something that we typically see down here in Miami, because it's like any big metropolitan hub, everything kind of gets.
Let me interject. Well, another thing you have in the United States are the depleted industrial towns in the Midwest. That immigrants are flowing there to revitalize these depleted former centers. In Detroit, for example. I mean, you go to Detroit. I mean, that city has largely been, last time I was there, it was all turned back into farmland. There are immigrants coming back. They're living where incumbent Americans don't want to live, and they're rebuilding these communities. So there is capacity. I think it's mainly a matter of political will and ensuring that the immigrants that do come, I do feel strongly about this, that they share in the institutions and in the culture. I mean, there has to be this. You can't come with kind of completely different idea of how to run your local communities. You can't be adopting you have to leave your battles in the old country. You have to leave them behind. When my parents came from Italy, war-torn Italy, and they settled in Vancouver. When I was growing up, I'm struck as I look back. I never grew up knowing anything about the political situation in Italy. My parents took the view that we are now Canadians, and I'm going to raise my kids as Canadians, and we're going to we're going to work hard and contribute to the Canadian way of life. Forget about Italy. I don't care what happened back then. I mean, it has no bearing on what is going to generate the prosperity in our country today. And I think immigrant groups have to understand that that's the attitude we have to take if we want to ensure social stability and general prosperity.
And keeping that train going, as we step into the national economy, as we step out of the global scene, which obviously seems to be a mess, torn with a lot of friction going on right now and a lot of people trying to escape various different countries, cities, and trying to look for a better life. As we step into the national economy, as we step into the US, and then we'll drill down into South Florida, what is the engine that's driving our economy today? As you see the economic engine, because obviously, as we go through the Industrial Revolution and we kind of move forward into this new technology age, and we're now faced with AI and all these other, incredible changes happening to society, and we see the skill sets of people needed. What are we seeing, or what are you seeing now is driving the U.S. economy, and what do we need to pay attention to?
Well, I mean, what's driving the U.S. economy, I guess, really, in my view, it's what's always driven it. It's just this incredible entrepreneurial spirit, this drive to succeed. People can make fun of the guy, but, Elon Musk, for example, these types of people, I mean, kind of embody kind of the American spirit.
Good old Jeff Bezos.
Jeff
Born
Bezos.
just down in Palmetto Bay, actually
Bay.
Down here, and his parents have a place here.
Yeah.
I mean, Miami, if you want to talk about entrepreneurial spirit, it's alive and well.
No, exactly. I mean, but I think not only that, but I think it's a partnership that Americans in general, and I include immigrants there. Immigrants are hard work. My parents are immigrants. I'm an immigrant.
I'm an
You're
immigrant.
An immigrant.
Yeah.
Hard working. We want to succeed. And so I'm cheering on Bezos. I'm cheering on Musk, but I'm also cheering on, our representatives in government as well, the ones that are enlightened and that can develop and defend the institutions that permit general prosperity to occur, because this is a private public sector partnership. We cannot think of this as the private sector versus government versus, this is a joint enterprise. We are all Americans, and I think that the institutions of this country permit this creativity to manifest itself in ways that it doesn't permit in other types of institutions or cultures around the world. That's what makes this country great. That's what draws people here. This is what accounts for the general level of prosperity. Despite all its warts, I understand, listeners, that things are not perfect, but we have to ask ourselves, what is the practical alternative?
Yes, and looking at the practicality of what we have in our country, what we're what we've adopted, what we've got, whether it's dealing with inflation, dealing with interest rates, dealing with, migration coming in. You can't just say, let's just reset and reformulate. It doesn't work like that. It's like every 4 years there are things that are happening. Now it's a case of where we're steering the train, or it's not a train, it's a mega boat, and it moves and it shifts slowly. You can't move it in one direction too fast. If I'm hearing you right, that you see the big driving force in the economy is entrepreneurship, and wherever entrepreneurship exists, economies will flourish. What are the things that you see damaging the economy, the national economy, really like hurting us, and not being well understood, that create a drain in the economy, or that create movement of wealth away from one area to another? Yeah,
to me, one thing that struck me coming from Canada to the United States, one thing was, first of all, Canada's a great country. I'm very, very proud of the nation, and it too is a system that generated widespread prosperity. Not as much as here in the United States, but there was much less disparity in Canada. And one thing that I noticed moving to St. Louis, which is where I moved to, was the amount of disparity across different communities is much, much larger in parts of the United States. Now, again, coming back to an earlier point, Americans typically don't mind disparity. What they mind is barriers that prevent them from succeeding. And so I do think, though, the one thing that takes away from the growth prospects of the country is if these disparities are permitted to persist in a manner that some communities find that they have no way out, that they feel trapped. Okay? If they feel trapped in poverty, their energies are going to be expressed in other ways. Break-ins, lawlessness, whatever. Right? And the well-to-do are going to potentially respond to this not by leveling the playing field or making sure that they have opportunity to succeed. They might respond by building gated communities. Imagine building gated communities to protect yourself against your fellow American.
Well, it exists today. I mean,
yes.
if you've obviously come into Miami the last couple of years. I've experienced, and the first thing you say when you think about a disparity, we have a lot of people who move in from California, and the California policies aren't changing right now. And there's a number of laws that they have that are designed, I don't know exactly why, I'm not a politician, but there were things like, if you steal under $500 worth of stuff out of a CVS or a Walgreens, they won't arrest you, they'll give you a ticket. Or if you find yourself going into someone's property they won't arrest you. They'll just move you off the property. And there are squatters' rights and there are others' rights that exist within other states, that because the disparity exists and it's forcing, or it's let's say encouraging friction, you've now got situations where crime has gone up, where people don't feel as safe. And what we've experienced is people saying, you know what, I moved because one client has said to me, you know, I woke up in the morning and I went outside. This is a true story. Client, I went outside with my cup of coffee. My 6-year-old was sitting on a sun lounger by the pool. And there's a homeless guy sitting on the other side of the pool, just lying on a sun lounger. He was whacked out on fentanyl. And it was a 6-year-old. And immediately calls the cops. There's a guy on my property. He's just out of it. He's in my backyard. Cops come. Move him off the property. Are you going to arrest him? No, we're not going to arrest him. We're just going to move him off your property. The guy comes to, walks around the front of the house and just sits there on the sidewalk. And, you know, this guy's thinking to himself, my 6-year-old's kind of traumatized by this. And their policies aren't addressing these issues as they should. You know, that they are trying to handle things. I don't know if it's a good way or wrong way. It seems to me like it's not the best way of doing things. They've got a lot of, you know, tent cities that popped up in San Francisco and a lot of friction creating. And it is sad, and mental health is a big issue in the country. And there is a disparity that grows. And what we see is the bigger the disparity, you see these pockets of wealth. Go into California, go into LA, and you'll have Pacific Palisades, and you'll have Malibu, and you'll have, you know, Bel Air and Beverly Hills, and you'll have the houses. If they're not in a gated community, those houses are walled and gated, and pretty effectively so. Yeah. And this is something that people now question: do I want to live my life like this? Right. I live down the street, 5 minutes down the street, nice neighborhood here called Ponce Davis. Sometimes my daughter decides when she was younger, she's kind of over it now, but a few years ago she wanted to run a lemonade stand outside the house every weekend. And I'd be like, okay, if you want to do that, people would drive by, buy lemonade, you know, go out there walking the dogs. And I never worried. I never worried about her safety. But I do see and feel it from other people coming in. New York's the same. Yeah. New York has their own issues. I just wonder, as this grows, is the economy pushing us more towards more of a, in the current state, in your opinion, more of the isolated wealth, and the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? What are you seeing in the last, I don't know, let's say reflect in the last year, 2 years? How are you seeing it?
Yeah, I do see increasing disparities. The poor are not necessarily getting poorer, I have to say. I mean, they're generally living standards are increasing, but still, it kind of feels that way when you see, you know, if you see people like becoming spectacularly wealthy, even though you're becoming better off, you still feel like you're getting worse off. But and what I have in mind here is, you know, when we think about living standards, I think about what is it like to go to the dentist today versus when I was a kid. I mean, you know, I don't know. You got some listeners that are over the age of 50, perhaps.
You can't talk to me about dentistry. I'm from England. We don't have historically bad teeth.
There are, you know, okay, so I want to put it in perspective. But still, there are people who are poor. There's nothing wrong with that as long as they have an opportunity to escape it through hard work and initiative. There are those who are suffering mentally from dependencies and things like that. I think we have to be careful about that. This is horribly sad. And I think it's really incumbent upon us, the fortunate ones, to put pressure on our representatives to deal with it. I come from Vancouver. I remember there was a very well-run mental institution that I knew people who worked there that took good care of people who needed the help. And the provincial government decided to shut it down, purportedly because it wanted to permit these people to assimilate with the general community. Of course, what they really wanted to do was to cut costs. And now if you go to Vancouver, I mean, it's got one of the highest concentration neighborhoods of heroin dependency. I mean, these people it's a tremendously sad sight. And, you know, this is an example of being penny wise, pound foolish. I think this might even be an English expression.
That is. I use that term all the time. I say that all the time, especially to my kids.
Penny wise, pound foolish. Come on, guys. You, me, everybody. Come on, we're lucky. We're lucky. We can afford to pay a little bit more taxes as long as these taxes are diverted in a smart way. Let's make these investments in the community. It will make us all better off.
And spending the government spending, let's say, taxpayers' money wisely, is a huge part, and I think it's maybe one of the things that people think about the most. They look at their tax bill and saying, I'm paying all this money each year, where is my money going?
Yes.
And as we move into now an election coming around the corner, and again, as an economist, I want your opinion on this, I see a lot of people, one of the big question is this government going to spend our money wisely?
I mean, that's the key, that's the key question. I mean, we want our representatives to, represent us and to make wise choices. We're delegating the responsibility of making the actual choices to them. We should like to think that we're electing people who can make wise decisions that are in interest of the broader community. I don't know how, this process is never going to work perfectly.
Yeah, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
I can't go representative by representative and evaluate them. I guess that's what we have elections for. But all I can do is hope and pray that, people who are motivated to run for office or advise our policymakers can kind of think about, and these are the key questions: how to spend the money, how to divert the resources.
That's the economics question.
Yes.
How are you spending the money?
Yes.
Which brings me, jumping right into, let's get local now, into the Miami market. And I can tell you right now, one of the big conversations that we have, and probably the biggest thing that gives hesitation and pause for buyers and sellers, is I want to see how this election is going to play out. I want to see who's going to come into government. And then they're trying to decide how that party is going to benefit them or hurt them. My question is this: how much is it going to truly impact the day-to-day? And how is it going to truly impact the day-to-day for the people who are right now having a conversation with me in Miami, and I guess it would be the same in any city, buying or selling? What's the elements and forces that you think about as an economist?
In terms of the consequences of the November election?
Absolutely, yes.
My goodness, I think, David, this is a little bit above my pay grade. I think in terms of if the Dems win under Kamala, I think it would be reasonable to expect her to carry on largely the policies that Biden has implemented to this point. So a lot of the CHIPS Act, things like that. Efforts to kind of reshore kind of critical manufacturing of critical devices. I mean, I think the idea of that, in my mind, I'm going against a lot of economic wisdom that says we should.
I like this. This is good. This is where we get like really get the opinions out there. It doesn't have to be in line with the market. This is where we learn.
And I think that this is, I was part of the. I was actually mistaken when I was a younger man. I grew up. I came of age during the fall of the Soviet Union, the opening up of Eastern Europe. I mean, it was such a beautiful era.
I remember it. I remember it well. I remember the falling of the Berlin Wall. I remember it all.
And it was such a hopeful era. And in a world where people have a shared sense of values, free trade makes sense. You do want to develop ties with people and countries that have shared values. But of course, because you trust them. I'm willing to offshore my critical, chip production to whatever country because we're friends. Canada and the U.S. I mean, you can have you can count on Canada to manufacture and export a critical component to your military, spending or inputs. But China, Russia. Was it really sensible for Taiwan Semiconductor to be the most important chip producer in the world?
And in light of, I think NVIDIA just announced their brand new chip that they're launching,
all the
AI
chip makers, NVIDIA, kind of Intel, So what I'm getting at is the Democrats have at least taken initiatives to kind of bring this type of manufacturing back to the United States. So I actually think both parties kind of, this is kind of a bipartisan view. So
pros and cons on both sides of the fence.
Yeah, so I think even under GOP leadership, you're likely to see something like that happen. Now, the U.S. economy, as you mentioned before about the inertial aspect, it's a huge ocean liner. It's going to go move forward almost largely independent of who gets into office, especially in the near term.
Yes.
So I think from an economic perspective, I don't know. I think I'd go so far as to say, to a first approximation, the impact on the economy, especially in the near term, the next 4 or 5 years, is not going to be super consequential. Yeah. I might see a lot more, it might have a lot more difference in terms of our international policy. And that might come back to feed back into the economy. Yeah. I don't know. But these, Dave, I'm telling you, these are areas where we could speculate all afternoon.
You know, you said something that really makes sense to me, because I've been through a number of elections. I've been in this real estate game long enough that I've been through three elections, and I've seen the initial pause and hesitation, and then I've seen the results come through, whether people like it or don't, and they're like, oh, I just got to get on with my life now. And it's business as usual. And the truth is that in the grand scheme of things, it hasn't affected people's lives as much as maybe they may have expected it to. They jumped on the media is very, very good at creating drama, polarization, and extreme behavior. And right now, I see it all the time. I mean, the irony is I'm sitting here doing a podcast, throwing stones at armchair experts. People who live in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones. I'm not an expert pundit. I'm just someone who's very curious about the whole process, and I live in a very small microcosm of South Florida. And I observe what human beings are doing around me, and I try to understand their behavior, and then I try to understand what's influencing their behavior and what things they might not see that I can make them aware of in their decision-making process to make a better decision, hence the title of our podcast. As we go into this situation, yes, that politics I don't see making that much of an impact for the short term. For the local economy, the Florida economy, the next 5 years, there's a term called Long Miami. I don't know if you've heard of this term. It's come out in front of you, but it basically means that you can speculate what might happen in the 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, year. Markets have little bups. There's like a little movement. It's like, don't try and day trade. It's a bad idea. Generally, you might get lucky. You might get spoilt. You might hit a few, cherries on the game of roulette, but it's not roulette. Clearly, I don't play gambling, but you know what I mean. The one-armed bandits. But the situation that you're dealing with is you've got these, you've got the risks that are being taken with end users. The consumers need to be thoughtful about the long term. The buyers, the sellers need to be long-term. And these little hiccups are really little hiccups. They're kind of glitches, nothing. But long-term, Long Miami is one with positive migration, huge amounts of entrepreneurship, which is the driving engine within Miami. Obviously, we've got great wealth. Obviously, we've got probably more balance, shall we say, between the haves, or say the haves and the have-nots. We don't have friction. This is probably the thing that I noticed. Huge amounts of friction that exist within communities. We don't have high crime. It doesn't feel like we have high crime. We don't have some of the problems that other states are experiencing, and then the people are coming through. But we have positive cash flow, money coming in from other states. Actually, I think it's $1 trillion. The statistic is $1 trillion of wealth has migrated out of New York and California to Florida and Texas in the last couple of years, and the majority of it flowing into Florida. And then obviously all the new businesses coming in. And if you there's a laundry list of, big hedge funds with, Citadel driving the charge coming in. These are all things that long term suggest great prosperity for South Florida, whether it's Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, or Miami. And obviously, the cities are growing and people are moving out into the suburbs area because sometimes it gets more expensive. What is your economic opinion? I know you've only been down here for a couple of years, but do you have an economic opinion of the driving forward of the U.S. economy over the next few years, and whether or not you see this reposition, and it's been discussed, I had this with Anna Bozovic, who's an economist, this reposition of wealth within our country, a movement, as you said, wealth shifts. Wealth shifted, we were the center of the world after World War II. And now you've got emergence of powers like India and China and Russia now coming into play to move the fiscal control of the world from potentially from one source to another. It can happen at a smaller scale. What's your opinion of that? Do you see anything coming across from other states? Do you have any opinions in that area?
Yeah, wow, you really set me up here.
I did a little bit. No, but I'd love you to tell me. And actually, no, I don't. I think that's...
Well, let me say, Long Miami, I moved down here. So I'm bullish on Miami, like many people are. I think the potential down here is just remarkable. And I mean, the only, with the caveat that I do hope that the local state and local governments do pay attention to the distributional. We have to make sure that there's a lot of people with tremendous wealth. We need for these people to make sure that either themselves or through the pressure they put on our representatives to make sure that the broader community is serviced. Otherwise, we're going to be living in a hellhole.
Well, that's why I want to know what can upset our economic apple cart?
So that's one. And then the other one, of course, I'm surprised you didn't mention, was the rising sea levels, which I suppose I'm actually bullish on that as well because...
I want to get into that. I hadn't even thought of that. But all right, let's unpack that conversation.
I think maybe we might become like the Netherlands. I mean, we do have technology to deal with the rising sea level. So no, I'm a little bit kidding there. So I'm bullish on Miami. I'm generally bullish on the United States as well. Although, there are regional, if you look at the history of the United States, I mean, the East is the traditional powerhouse. The power in the United States has shifted westward over the course of the last century. And now recently you see much of that power now coming and migrating south to Texas and Florida. And I think I see in the near term those patterns to continue. So within the United States, there are going to be these regional migrations, hopefully immigrants often, and also households that have trouble affording real estate in high-priced jurisdictions often move and revitalize St. Louis, Detroit, and perhaps we'll see a revitalization of the hollowed-out industrial, the Rust Belt in the United States. So that's bullish. In the grander scheme of things, what I think Americans have to understand, my own view, is look, China is coming back. It was down for a few centuries, but it's back. It's a very old and proud culture. I mean, they've been around for 2,000 years, much longer, an order of magnitude longer than the United States. They're back. And we have to understand and respect that. I mean, we don't have to like it, and we don't have to necessarily tolerate if we perceive them to do bad things, but we do have to understand that we are dealing with a bona fide geopolitical rival. And, I think sometimes Americans, they might feel kind of bad that we're losing influence and power around the world, but it's just something that, I think we have to take a mature stand to it, because the alternative is conflict.
Yeah. So don't ignore it. So I'm going to throw something in there. This is a bit of a spanner in the works. So within Florida, we had a law that passed. I'm not sure how familiar are you with this, but this law that would state that Russian and Chinese nationals would not be able to buy real estate within a 15-mile location of a major airport, which basically is everything in Miami and Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach area. Do you think that's something that is necessary? Do you think there's positive to it? Do you think there's negative to it? Or do you think it has absolutely no impact whatsoever?
Well, right. I mean, a good question. I'm not enough of an expert to know. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction, to be honest, is I'd be in favor of those laws. Not so much, I'd be more in favor of reciprocity. I'd be very surprised if the Chinese permit us to buy real estate within a mile of whatever, military institute, right? Or Russia, for that matter. So it's unfortunate, but, I'd be in favor of some sort of reciprocity. So we don't have to kind of cast it as a unilateral measure. It's just, well, you guys don't trust us. This is what you do in your national jurisdiction. We're going to follow your advice and do it here too. I mean, if we ever comes a day where we become friends, we can relax those rules. Now, whether it has a material impact on espionage and things like that, I'm not so sure. I'm sure that, agents on both sides, us and them, are skilled and adept in getting around those types of rules. But, the principle of it, I can understand what motivates it. And certainly it's not going to make it easier for them to spy. And I'm afraid we're in a world where kind of distrust has been growing, and these types of measures, I'm not completely against them, to be honest.
And we have, to be clear, that policy applies to those people who are Chinese nationals or Russian nationals. These aren't people who are currently, let's say, born in China or have Chinese origins but are American citizens and have been here for many years. It's a different conversation altogether. But you definitely noticed, one thing particularly about Miami, like a number of cities, is that it's so multicultural, it's so multinational. And people often ask me, what's Miami like? And I'm like, you ever been to Singapore? Right, not a million miles away from what Miami can feel like, or Dubai. It has a huge international flavor, and there is a global citizen psychology, which I really appreciate. And I think that's one of the things that when people come in, the rest of the US sometimes may not share that same ethos, or it may not be as simpatico to that behavior. But we have a huge multicultural, multinational balance, and I call it a balance, which is wonderful.
We have a new dean at the Miami Herbert Business School, Paul Pavlou, very, very motivational leader, and he's explicitly, said that, what is it that makes the University of Miami different? What's our comparative advantage? What do we have that many, or if not most, other jurisdictions don't? And one of those attributes was exactly what you harped on, the diversity, the cultural diversity. It's a power. It's a power that can be used for good, to promote the good of the local community and of the country.
And locally, obviously you may have been down here for a few years, but your basis in education in academia is substantial. And the universities down in South Florida, openly, I'm here talking to you, I have an involvement with FIU. Mm-hmm. And I say that and statistically, the colleges down here, the universities, are moving up the national rankings quite substantially. And I know that historically people would be concerned, and my kids are only in 5th grade. But what's interesting is that I have many people coming in from other countries, and they say, I was concerned that my kids would come down to South Florida and they wouldn't get an education, or it wouldn't be stringent enough, it wouldn't be as challenging enough for them. They're not going to, come out of this and be able to, move back to the UK or Barcelona or Australia or wherever it might be, and compete and be suitable professionals. They won't be armed with the right skills. And actually, it seems to me, I've got friends who have come to me and said, my God, like the rigors of education down here are pretty solid. I know my 5th graders are working their butts off right now for their SSATs, and a lot of people are saying, well, it's actually really, really tough. It's really challenging, maybe because the competition down here is pretty fierce. Large migration, a lot of competition.
I'm very happy to hear that. I don't know that firsthand because my kids are now just out of school. I had the same feeling, though, in St. Louis. St. Louis is also a place where you get amazing public schools in some types of neighborhoods. And so I was very impressed. I'm very happy to hear what you report down here. And I know that higher education, too, is taken off. FIU is an institution that I greatly admire, in fact. And I have friends and colleagues that work there as well. We collaborate, and I just love seeing FIU succeed the way it does. I think these are two. UM
One of my good friends is, do you know Eli Braha?
Of course not. No, I don't know him.
So it's funny because I spend time with these kind of conversations, and obviously Eli is running the Hollow School of Real Estate, and again that's his area. But it's great to see the success of, and I want to extend this to all South Florida universities. The rankings have gone up, and I know you see kids applying to UM and then to Michigan, and it's harder to get into UM than it is to Michigan.
Yes.
And a lot of this, and I've got friends, obviously I've got great colleagues of mine out in Boston, and of course Boston, they've got Harvard and MIT and yada yada, the list goes on. And obviously I always say, well, it's you've got this great advantage because you've got this great academic, this intellectual resource. Yes. An intellectual resource expands to entrepreneurial resource. And I actually feel like now, we've got this whole new breed coming through, which I think is a big difference.
Listen, this I came down here because it was so exciting. There's University of Miami in particular. I think, despite its reputation, I think it has so much more to give, and I think that having a hub down here, having a center, an intellectual center, where people of the community, in the business community, politicians, just regular people, have an intellectual center that is cognizant of local concerns, that we can contribute to the debate, policy debates, both locally and nationally, to have a voice here in Miami, to get feedback with our partners in the private sector and the government sector. I think if any of the listeners out there want to come and join forces with us at the Miami Herbert Business School, we're really keen to develop partnerships to promote the University of Miami as a thought center, a place where we have nonpartisan economic analysis, political analysis, where we can inform our policymakers, where we can educate our neighbors about what's going on, and basically just contributing to the debate. I mean, if you want to partake in this endeavor, this joint endeavor, we're very happy to have you as partners. Please reach out and contact me.
Absolutely. And I would say to everyone, look, our relationship was just started. I am a big believer in think tank psychology. I will happily share my data, pull my resources for analytics. I would love to pull some of your analytical data and resources, because at the end of the day, it's just part of that big puzzle of economic life, and we're trying to figure out how it all fits together and how it works. I want to thank you for doing this. I'm going to finish with a fun little exercise. It's a quick fire round of 10 questions.
All right.
There are no, as I've said this before to people who have come on the podcast, there are no right, there are no wrong answers. So I'm going to fire this off. And I don't want any hesitation, just literally fire off the first response that you want to give.
All right.
Okay. Inflation, temporary concern or long-term threat?
Long-term threat.
Recession, coming soon or avoiding it entirely?
Avoiding.
Interest rate drops, making a wave or making ripples?
Ripple.
Crypto, fad or future of finance?
Both.
Best investment, real estate or stock market?
Keep hedged, my friend.
Global economy, resilient or shaky ground?
Oh, shaky.
US dollar, stronger or weaker in 2025?
Absolutely.
Let's kind of make of that what you will. Miami real estate, overvalued or still a bargain?
Overvalued in the short run, bargain long run.
Nice. Miami migration, moving back or moving forward?
Moving forward, my friend.
UM or FIU?
Oh, both jewels of South Florida.
I love that answer. Bonus question, long Miami or not for long?
My friend, long. We're long Miami.
Thank you very much, David.
My pleasure. My
Appreciate
pleasure.
this. Wonderful.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for everyone watching this episode of the Better Decisions podcast. Hope you learned something today. Stay tuned for another episode coming soon.